She did not choose him. That is the first thing to understand. She was perhaps 17, perhaps 16, standing near a window in a house that smelled of beeswax and damp wool, and somewhere across the village, a decision was being made about the rest of her life, without her. This is a story told in rooms, in silences, in the weight of a hand placed on a young woman's shoulder, and the words, "It has been arranged." To reconstruct moments like this one, I work with old paintings, faded engravings, and handwritten records, many of them digitally restored through artificial intelligence, which allows me to move through details that were once too dim or too damaged to see clearly. I can zoom into a face in a Dutch interior, trace the shadow in the corner of a room, and begin to feel what it meant to live inside it. What draws me to this work is not spectacle. It is something quieter, a genuine desire to understand how women moved through the world in centuries when so much was decided for them. The fire had been lit since before dawn. That is how you know a household is preparing for something. The hearth in the main room was already stacked high, and the smell of rosemary and boiled cloth filled the low stone corridor that led from the kitchen to the sleeping rooms. Marta, we will call her that, was somewhere between girl and woman in the way that the 17th century compressed that distance into almost nothing. She had been braiding her hair for the third time that morning, not from vanity, but from anxiety. There was a visiting family expected by noon, and her mother had told her, without quite meeting her eyes, to look presentable. That word, presentable, carried an enormous weight in 1600s Europe. It meant something different than it does now. It meant be inspectable, be accessible, be ready to be seen as a thing of value. The braid slipped again. She started over. She had heard the name of the man before, a merchant's son from a neighboring town, older by at least 10 years, they said. Reliable, they said, as if reliability were the architecture of a life worth living. By the time the visitors arrived, the room had been rearranged, chairs placed at deliberate angles. A pewter jug of spiced wine set near the center of the table. Small acts of staging, performed by women who understood that a domestic space could speak before anyone in it did. Courtship in the 17th century was rarely about the two people at its center. It was a negotiation between families shaped by property, social rank, and religious expectation. In Catholic households across France, Spain, and Italy, the church presided over the entire process, from the first formal visit to the exchange of vows. In Protestant regions of England and the Dutch Republic, civil records and community witnesses added another layer of scrutiny. Love, if it appeared at all, was considered secondary. A pleasant addition, perhaps, but never the foundation. Marta sat near the window while the men talked. This was customary. She was visible, but not included. She could be observed by the visiting family, her posture, her complexion, the texture of her dress, the way she lowered her eyes with the appropriate degree of modesty. Too much eye contact suggested boldness, too little suggested weakness. There was a precise, unspoken calibration required, and girls learned it not from instruction, but from watching their mothers perform it again and again in rooms exactly like this one. The visiting merchant's son glanced at her twice. The second time, he smiled. She did not smile back, but she noticed. The formal betrothal, when it came, and it came quickly within a matter of weeks, was announced at church. This was not simply a social formality. In the 1600s, a public declaration of betrothal was legally significant in many parts of Europe. It could not be broken without consequence. It created obligations that were almost impossible to undo, particularly for the woman. From the moment of betrothal, Marta's life changed in texture, if not yet in location. She was no longer simply her father's daughter. She was becoming someone's wife. The space between these two states was narrow and closely monitored. Chaperones were present during visits. Letters, if written at all, were often read by parents. Physical contact was regulated by both religious norms and social surveillance. And yet, within these constraints, something human persisted. It always does. Some women of this period recorded, in diaries and letters that survived by accident rather than design, their genuine feelings about the men they were promised to. Some wrote with warmth, some with dread, many with a resigned, pragmatic clarity that is both difficult to read and impossible not to admire. They understood the system they were inside. They were not naive about it. And still, they found ways to carry their interior lives quietly forward through prayer, through friendship with other women, through the small territories of freedom that domestic space sometimes allowed. The kitchen was often one of those territories, the garden another. Places where a woman moved with authority, where her knowledge and skill were visible and respected, even if that respect had strict boundaries. The ceremony was brief by modern standards. A church, a priest or minister, witnesses from both families, and vows spoken in a language most people in the congregation only partially understood. Latin in Catholic regions, or a formal liturgical English that felt distant from daily speech. The dress was not white. That tradition had not yet taken hold. She likely wore her best garment, something in dark blue or deep red, or the warm ochre of natural dye, fabric she might wear again for years. The reception was held at her father's home. Food, music from a fiddle or lute, dancing in the yard if the weather allowed. Neighbors came. Ale was passed. There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that fills old rooms and makes a moment feel like it will last forever. And then it ended, and she went with him. This is the part that old paintings tend to leave out. The carriage pulling away from a family she had known every hour of her life. The unfamiliar sounds of a different house at night. A new bed. A new kitchen to memorize in the dark. A husband who was, in almost every legal and social sense, her entire world now, for better or worse, as the vows said, but with very little structural mechanism for determining which it would be. What she brought with her, besides a modest dowry and a chest of linens, was herself. Her knowledge of herbs and remedies, her ability to manage a household, her prayers, which were her own, and a kind of interior endurance that 17th century women developed early and maintained quietly as a matter of survival. Across Europe in the 1600s, this story repeated itself in thousands of variations. Different countries, different religions, different class positions, but the central structure remained. A woman's future was arranged before she fully understood what a future meant. What changed over the centuries was slow, uneven, and hard-won. Legal reforms that gave women the right to refuse consent came gradually, unevenly, and often incompletely. The idea that a woman's emotional experience of her own marriage mattered, that she was not simply a vessel for continuity, but a person with preferences, desires, and the right to shape her own life. That idea took a very long time to become law, and longer still to become practice. But what is remarkable, looking into these reconstructed images, into the candlelit rooms and the careful faces, is not only what was taken from these women, it is what they kept: their networks of friendship and mutual aid, their knowledge passed from mother to daughter, their faith interpreted quietly on their own terms, their humor, which barely survives in the historical record, but which must have existed, must have, in kitchens and gardens and whispered conversations across a fence. Marta's braid, started 3 times on a winter morning, never made it into the history books. But she was there. She was real. And the question she carried, is this a good life? Is this mine? Is a question that women in every century have asked in the privacy of their own minds, in rooms both grand and narrow. Some things have changed, not everything. And perhaps that is why these old interiors, restored light by light through technology and time, still feel so close. If there is a place or a time in women's history you would like to see reconstructed next, leave it in the comments. Every era has its own room, and every room has someone standing in it, beginning again.